When you hear the words knight-errant, what image pops into your head? Probably a lone figure.
Yeah, like a wandering hero maybe from one of those martial arts epics, someone roaming around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Roaming the land, righting wrongs, protecting the innocent, just generally being this unstoppable force for good. It's a really powerful idea, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Almost mythical.
If that's the kind of thing you're picturing, well, you're definitely not alone. That romantic vision has captivated people for ages.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the twist, and it's a fascinating one.
Mm.
What if that popular image is, like, vastly different from the historical reality?
Mm-hmm.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the really complex history of the knight-errant, or Isia, in ancient China. We're going to try and figure out how their meaning shifted so dramatically over the centuries.
And why their stories suddenly became so big in Tang Dynasty fiction.
Exactly. And what these figures actually represented in different times.
It's quite a journey, actually, because it really challenges those ideas we probably all have. We'll need to peel back the layers of myth, to understand the true nature of these figures, from their often quite surprising origins all the way to their fictionalized glory. It's a much more nuanced story than just the heroic archetype.
I think most of us start with that classic, almost modern image, don't we? This idea of someone who acts with, like, incredible generosity.
Right, helping the weak.
Speaks out against injustice, steps in where the law fails, and then if they really go above and beyond, serve the nation, they become this great knight. It's super compelling.
It really is. You see it everywhere in modern books and movies. But when you actually trace the historical roots of the term exia, the picture is remarkably different.
How so?
Well, for one thing, the concept wasn't even really a big deal during the spring and autumn period. There's a key text from back then, the Zuo Zhuan. It records all sorts of events and speeches.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
Yeah.
Very detailed.
Exactly. And it doesn't mention the word exia at all. It was really during the next phase, the Warring States period, which was much more chaotic, that the term gained traction.
Okay.
And it's Han Feizi, a major legalist philosopher, who gives us these two incredibly stark definitions. And honestly, they're pretty surprising. They really capture what a knight-errant was back then.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did he say?
His first definition, it kind of hits you. Knights-errant violate the law with force.
Wow. Violate the law.
Yeah, think about that. It means they specifically used violence to defy state law, to go against the ruler. So by definition, they were opposing authority.
That's not the hero image at all.
Not even close. And the second definition, gangs of knights sustain themselves through private violence.
Gangs sustain themselves.
Right. It implies that for many, knighthood wasn't just some noble calling. It was, well, an economic activity, a job, basically, a way to make a living using force.
Wow. Okay, that is a complete paradigm shift. Violating the law, private violence for sustenance. That sounds less like a hero and more like, I don't know, a mercenary or someone involved in, like, protection rackets.
It definitely leans that way, historically speaking.
It makes you wonder then, who would even support figures like that? Especially if they were actively defying the state.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The people who actually benefited from these early knights, the ones providing the patronage, were typically the aristocracy.
Ah, okay. The nobles.
Exactly. During the Warring States period, remember, many powerful nobles were kind of in opposition to their own central rulers, just like the knights they sponsored. So by supporting these armed enforcers...
They could boost their own power.
Precisely. They could bolster their own authority, sometimes even dominate their monarchs. That's why figures like the four lords of the Warring States, these really powerful aristocrats known for patronizing warriors, were sometimes called great knights themselves.
So their greatness wasn't about morality, but about commanding force.
Often, yes. It stemmed from their ability to gather and command these kinds of forces.
So these knights were basically private muscle for the elite. It really shows how fragmented power could be. But, okay, what happens when the central government tries to push back, when it tries to assert itself against these decentralized forces? We see that tension a lot in history, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us straight to the Qin dynasty. Even before unification, starting with Sheng Yang's reforms, the Qin state had a very clear, you might say ruthless policy: suppress the aristocracy and make sure all violence was controlled by the state.
Monopolize force.
Exactly. So when Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, unified China, he went after the nobility of the states he conquered hard, and that inevitably meant targeting their knightly retainers too.
And was he successful?
Remarkably so. Many aristocrats and their knights were exiled or forced to move to the capital, Shenyang. This left a lot of their lower-ranking followers kind of adrift, jobless.
Any examples?
Liu Bang is a perfect one, the guy who later founded the Han Dynasty. Before unification, he was a retainer working for a knight named Zhang Er.
Okay.
After Qin unified China, Zhang Er became a fugitive. Liu Bang suddenly lost his patron and had to take a pretty low-level government job.
Huh. So the system changed everything for him.
It really did. Now, what's also interesting is that during the chaos right at the end of the Qin dynasty, when rebellions broke out everywhere, many of the key figures leading those rebellions, including Liu Bang himself and his big rival Zheng Yu, were actually called knights.
Because they were fighting the government.
Exactly. They were anti-government forces by nature, and that period of rebellion was their time. But here's the great paradox.
Let me guess.
Yeah.
Once they got power, they didn't like knights anymore.
You got it. Once these rebels became emperors, they turned against the very kind of knights they used to be. Liu Bang especially, it seems he had this lifelong, almost sort of nostalgic soft spot for the idea of knighthood. Makes him seem a bit more human, maybe.
A complex figure.
Definitely. But while he had other things to deal with early on, the really big clash between the imperial government and the knights, that truly kicked off during the reign of Emperor Wu of Han.
Right. Emperor Wu. What did he do?
Well, he didn't just execute a famous knight like Guoji, though he did do that. He went deeper. He systematically attacked the conditions that let knighthood thrive.
Which meant going after their patrons. The aristocracy.
Exactly. Since knights depended so heavily on aristocratic support, Emperor Wu deliberately and often brutally weakened the nobility. Powerful patrons like Luan, Tianfen, Du Ying, they all met pretty tragic ends under his rule.
So if you wanted to survive,
you had to play by the new rules. Look at General Wei Qing, a brilliant military leader. He famously refused to keep retainers, even though people criticize him for it.
Why refuse?
Because he understood the political climate. Having your own independent power base, your own loyal followers, that was incredibly dangerous under Emperor Wu. Wei Qing's refusal probably saved his career, maybe even his life. It really shows that drive of a strong empire to centralize power.
That's a really clear picture of the state trying to stamp out these independent forces. It also makes you think, though, about how different people, even at the same time, could see these knights so differently. It sounds like even the ancient historians didn't agree on them.
Oh, absolutely not. There's a fascinating contrast between Sima Qian, the sort of grand historian, and Ban Gu, who came a generation or so later.
Sima Qian wrote the records of the grand historian, right?
That's the one, a monumental work. And he was famously passionate. His portrayal of knights is much more romanticized. Maybe it was because of some connection in his youth or just his personality. He definitely saw their problematic side, but you can feel his emotional investment in their stories.
And Bangu.
Bangu, well, his own ancestors were actually knights, but he looked at them with this really dispassionate, almost clinical historian's eye.
Interesting. What was his take?
His analysis is really insightful. He basically traced how central authority declined, starting way back in the Zhou dynasty. As the emperor's power faded, he argued, it first went to the feudal lords, then to the regional rulers. And finally, it landed with these low-born individuals wielding disproportionate influence. That was his term for the knights.
Low-born individuals.
Yeah, and his main point was this. Whenever imperial authority got strong again, the aristocracy got pushed down and poof, the knights lost their support system, their footing. It reinforces that inverse relationship we keep seeing.
Strong state, weak knights, weak state.
More room for knights to operate. It's a classic case of how perspective shapes our understanding.
It really hammers home how much our view of history depends on who's telling the story. One historian's romantic figure is another's destabilizing force. Okay, so if the Qin and Han dynasties tried so hard to suppress them, you'd think that would be the end of it. But history rarely works like that, does it? How did they make a comeback, especially in the later Han period?
You're right. History definitely has its cycles. By the late Eastern Han dynasty, things had shifted again. Those powerful aristocratic families, they'd clawed back a lot of their influence.
And the knights followed.
And naturally, knights started to reemerge right alongside them. You hear about many of the famous warlords from that messy period, like Cao Cao and Yuan Shao, being described as fond of being knights.
Even the famous ones.
Yep. Even someone like Lu Bu, known for his fighting skills, was called a frivolous knight. And get this, the term great knight, She even started showing up, but sometimes used negatively.
Negatively? How?
It was used as a label for someone like Lu Dan, who was basically a scholar known for being cliquish and aggressive. So you can see the term itself was still shifting, maybe even losing any positive shine it might have had.
So it wasn't necessarily a compliment anymore.
Not always, no. So if we kind of boil it down, stripping away all the later romantic stuff, the original unmoralized idea of a knight was basically someone who formed gangs, glorified violence, defied state laws, and was tangled up with aristocratic power. And crucially, their activity level was always the opposite of imperial strength. Strong empire, fewer knights. Weak empire, more knights. This historical background is absolutely key when we shift our focus to the Tang Dynasty.
Okay, so here's the big question, the really intriguing one for me. Given this pretty gritty, often anti-authority history, why on earth did chivalric fiction stories celebrating these knights suddenly explode in popularity in the mid to late Tang Dynasty?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Totally. What changed to make these figures, who were often seen as troublemakers, suddenly become literary heroes?
The game changer, fundamentally, was the An Lushan Rebellion.
Ah, a major turning point.
Huge. Catastrophic, really. It dealt this massive blow to the Tang state, leaving it incredibly weakened, politically fragmented. The era after the rebellion wasn't one of strong central control.
So more like the warring states again, fragmented power.
In a way, yes. It was marked by this delicate, often unstable balance of power between different factions, regional governors, powerful court eunuchs, influential families. This kind of environment where state authority was shaky and decentralized power bases were common.
It was perfect for knights.
It was absolutely ripe for knightly activity, or at least the idea of it. And because of that, it provided the perfect fertile ground for chivalric fiction to just take root and bloom. These stories reflected the reality, but also the aspirations of the time, even if the characters were heavily idealized.
It's almost like society needed those stories more when the actual government couldn't guarantee order or justice.
That could definitely be part of it. People crave heroes, especially when times are tough.
This is where it gets really captivating, because this is where that popular image we started with really begins to solidify, fueled by these Tang stories. So what kinds of tales were they telling? What were the main themes?
Well, we can basically group the Tang knight-errant tales into 3 major themes, and each one adds another layer to how we ended up thinking about the Kexia. First, you had stories focused on duels.
Okay, action-packed stuff.
Definitely. Heavy focus on martial skill, sometimes even supernatural abilities. They often featured these figures called sword immortals, people with almost magical fighting prowess.
Sword immortals.
Yeah.
Sounds cool.
Yeah, and these duel-focused narratives were hugely influential. They really laid the foundation for later wuxia fiction, the kind of martial arts chivalry stories from huge names like Jin Yang and Liang Yushen.
Ah, the classics of the genre. Okay, so duels is one. What else?
The second theme was repaying debts. This connects back more directly to the historical reality we talked about.
Right, the patronage system.
Exactly. Many historical knights under the surface were acting out of obligation to patrons who'd helped them out, financially or politically. The best Tang stories in this vein took these transactions and romanticized them.
Made them seem noble.
Precisely. Presented them as acts of righteousness, fulfilling a sacred bond, not just, hired muscle doing a job.
Okay, so duels, repaying debts. What's the third?
The third theme, and this is arguably the one that had the biggest long-term impact, was upholding justice.
Ah, there's the hero image again.
This is where it really takes hold. These stories showed knights stepping in to fix injustices, often based purely on their own personal moral code, especially when the official law or the authorities failed.
Were these based on real events at all?
Some were, surprisingly. There's a famous one, The Tale of Feng Yan, where a knight kills an adulterous woman to save her innocent husband from being wrongfully executed. That seems to have roots in a real incident.
Wow.
But many others were pure fantasy. Still, they all tapped into this deep societal frustration, this real desire for heroic intervention when the system wasn't working.
So which theme became dominant?
Well, while repaying debts was probably closer to the historical reality for many knights, it was upholding justice that really took off and became the central trope in later wuxia fiction.
Why do you think that is?
Probably because it better fulfilled that audience yearning for heroism, for a perfect, unwavering sense of right and wrong, especially in confusing or unjust times.
And that's really where our modern perception got locked in, isn't it? From these Tang stories emphasizing justice. It's quite a journey.
A remarkable transformation, really.
So we've traced this path from the historically complex, sometimes downright problematic definition of a knight-errant, all the way to the romanticized hero most of us picture today. It's so clear these changes weren't just random. They were deeply linked to the rise and fall of state power and what society needed or wanted to believe at different times.
Absolutely. The context is everything.
It really makes you pause and think, though. What does it tell us about ourselves, about our societies, that we so often romanticize these figures who, if we're honest about the history, often existed outside the law and actively challenged the established order?
That's the final provocative thought, isn't it? What is it in us that resonates so strongly with these figures? What deep-seated yearning for justice, maybe, or even for freedom from what feels like overwhelming authority, do these enduring tales of chivalry continue to tap into?
Yeah.
Even when we strip away their actual messy historical context, the private violence, the aristocratic power plays, these idealized figures still hold power over our imagination. It seems to suggest there's this timeless human desire for someone, anyone, to stand up when things feel wrong.
Regardless of whether they're following the rules or not.
Exactly. Maybe the ideal of justice, however complicated its historical origins, ultimately speaks louder to us than the often harsh realities of power and politics.
That's a truly profound thought to end on. It highlights the incredible power stories have to reshape history in our collective memory. We really hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity.
And maybe encouraged you to always look a little deeper, beyond the surface of those familiar heroes.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.